So good afternoon and welcome. I'm Stephanie Traina from Memorial Hall Library, and we're grateful to the Addison Gallery for these virtual talks. So if you want to hear about upcoming events, you can sign up for our MHL newsletter at mhl.org/newsletter. I'll send it through in the chat. But we send out a 10 things email on Friday and then an upcoming events at the library every Sunday. So today's program is being recorded and it'll be available on the library's Vimeo channel eventually. For those of you who don't know him, Gordon Wilkins is the Robert M. Walker Curator of American Art at the Addison Gallery, which is a world-class museum on the campus of Phillips Academy here in Andover. So he joined the Addison in 2018 after stints at the Peabody Essex Museum, the Farnsworth Art Museum, and several others. Gordon will talk about the period today of between 1930 and 1950. So please join me in giving him a warm virtual welcome.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And again, thank you very much to everyone who's attending and also to the Memorial Hall Library for making these so pleasant to, these talks so pleasant to be a part of. So today we're going to finish, finally, after two sessions, this is our third, we're going to finish our tour of Crosscurrents, American Art 1850 to 1950. And before I get started, you see this beautiful summertime view, certainly not what the Addison looks like today with all of our snow and sleet and all kinds of nasty puddles, that kind of thing. But we are open to the public and we certainly have reduced hours. We're open Friday, Saturday, Sunday to the community at large. And if you're interested in visiting the Addison and to learn about all of our safety preparedness measures, don't hesitate to visit our website, addisongallery.org, to reserve your free time ticket. So this show closes in just around 3 weeks. So you have a little bit of time to see it. And I do hope that perhaps these talks have incentivized some of you to come visit if you're comfortable doing so. Let's see, here we go. Okay. So as Stephanie mentioned, this is the final section of the exhibition dealing with a 20-year period from roughly 1930 to roughly 1950. I was pretty good about staying within my time constraints, but you'll notice there's maybe one or two works that fall outside of 1950, maybe 1951, 1952, but hopefully no one will hold it against me. So just to orient you in the space, we're in the gallery right now looking that we started off in. It's gallery 201 with the wonderful Solowitt wall piece, which you can see on the top of your screen. And we've gone on the other side. What we saw last week is behind us, figuratively and literally. We looked at the teens and the 20s in American art through the Addison's collection. And now we're going to look at the 1930s and 40s. And what's interesting about this era is that it coincides with really the beginning of the Addison. The Addison is 90 years old this year. We opened our doors to the public in May of 1931. The building of the collection started in the late 1920s. So this is an era in which the works that you see were contemporary. Many of the works that you'll see were acquired while the artists were still very much living, breathing contemporary artists. And because of that, there's a lot of rich archival material and with that we have for many of these objects, where we actually have correspondence directly between the Addison and the artist that created the work, copious correspondence between the Addison and galleries, selling the work. So it's a really such a rich period in the Addison's history when the Addison was really spreading its wings. It was developing its identity. Its taste in the 1930s from the very beginning was a bit more on the conservative side, but that certainly was not the case throughout its history. And luckily, a lot of the kind of gaps that were created by the collecting practices in the 30s and 40s have since been filled. So you'll see a lot of work that was acquired when the work was contemporary, and then work that's been acquired over time in order to reinforce our holdings. Here we have a little peek into the first gallery that I'll discuss. the other thing I want to just mention about this show in general is that the title, which if you've attended, you'll know the whole story behind the show. It's a survey of our collection. Everything in the show is part of the Addison's nearly 23,000 object collection. And what I wanted to do with this show was to present a lot of our greatest hits, as we call them, the recognizable, very iconic works of art, but then to add that kind of layer of familiarity, but then defamiliarize the viewer. So to have these points of reference that are quite recognizable, and then throw in things that are that will catch you completely off guard. And that can be either because it's by an artist that you're likely to never have heard of, or in many cases it's an unfamiliar work by a familiar artist, or it's something that just hasn't been shown for years and years and years for various reasons. So this is meant to give a little bit more of a nuanced glimpse. It's also a technique that we very rarely use. That's the chronological hang. Since we rotate our galleries constantly, we like to do a lot of interdisciplinary thematic shows. You won't see a chronological show very frequently at the Addison. This is an interesting exception. And it allows you to really see a concentrated body of work of American art that was created at the same time. And we often like to sort of cloister artists or see them as these singular figures that were kind of outside of time. We established this very clean trajectory of, making a straight line from the very earliest American art to the present, with mostly white male figures in between. The great names of American art, they're all represented in this show, but also there's a lot more interesting sort of material that doesn't get seen and is increasingly becoming more and more the focus of scholarly attention. So it's a bit to kind of problematize, to make a little bit more nuanced the narratives of American art history that we're so familiar with, and also the narratives of American history broadly. So we start off in this smaller gallery, concentrated gallery, with this wall of 3 works. And you might think, why are these together? I was really interested in the solitary figure, and not necessarily a human figure, kind of looking at how the inanimate can be rendered almost animate in these works, particularly the first 2, which will focus on George Alt's Dead Tree #2 and Oscar Blumner's Radiant Night. And these are both works that are devoid of any human beings. You don't see figures, but they are so psychologically loaded and so rich with emotion that it's quite amazing that these 2 artists were able to imbue the inanimate with such profound emotion. So on the left, we have George Alt's Dead Tree. This was acquired in 1935 while George Alt was living. He exhibited at the Addison while he was a living artist. He's perhaps best known for his precisionist works, but he was, unlike a lot of his contemporaries, really not a proponent of the metropolitan, of the urban, of the cosmopolitan, the masses and the big skyscrapers. He saw those actually as kind of signs of America's decline. And he was more interested in the rural environment and the suburban environment. So here we have a tree that's dead, and this sort of play between darkness and light renders the tree quite stark in comparison, and quite disturbing with its gnarled branches, almost looking like sort of atrophied hands reaching out to get you. Oscar Blumner on the right, and these works were created more or less in the same year. You can see he's also sort of anthropomorphizing this tree, but the house is really what carries the painting. And we've seen other examples of kind of melancholic architecture, particularly with the Edward Hopper works, that particularly Manhattan Bridge Loop, which we looked at last week. But this house is almost a character. It is really a full-fledged character imbued with emotions. And when you think about the biography of the artist, and these are 2 artists that aren't particularly well known. Blumner is getting to be, or perhaps more known than Alt, but still neither have reached the Andrew Wyeth, Jackson Pollock, Stuart Davis level of name recognition. This was painted by Oscar Blumner after a very traumatic period where he was evicted from his longtime home in New Jersey and moved to South Braintree, Massachusetts. His wife died in the mid 1920s. He was absolutely heartbroken by that, but also he was always more or less penniless, and that situation was certainly not improved by the Great Depression. So reading this within the context of the Great Depression, both works, they take on new meaning. And then also the personal story of Blumner, having lost his wife, having lost his beloved home, moving to South Braintree, Massachusetts, trying to find work. He actually sent letters to the Addison begging essentially to be put in exhibitions. The Addison was very kind to him during his lifetime. Both artists would go on to commit suicide, which was not an intentional pairing, but I think if you think about the emotional gravity of both works, think about the context of the Depression, the period of great hopelessness in America, not being able to really see a way out. Both works, when read through those lenses, take on, I would say, great significance and great meaning in addition to just what's on the surface. But without that context, they're both really exquisite representations of the natural world in the case of, well, inanimate, the dead tree in both cases. And then also you have that wonderful tree on the left of Radiant Night that also sort of looks like a claw that's about to grab you. So not the most welcoming pictures to start off with. But the one thing I'll mention, Blumner was an immigrant from what is current day Germany. And I found this really wonderful quote while I was doing a little bit of research on him. And it ties into a lot of the issues that we've discussed throughout this series of talks. And that is, what is really American about American art? And he has something really interesting to say about that in a op-ed that he contributed to a debate in the New York Times on the question, what is American art? He wrote, and this is an excerpt, "Let us here make progressive and best painting," here being the United States, "each one as he is fit to do, and merely ask, what and when is painting in a critical sense? How can the people agree on what is American style if the painters themselves, and by their work, disagree profoundly as to what real painting itself is? And there is, and always was, nothing more contemptible, ridiculous, and to art disastrous than patrioteering, which thinly veils profiteering. Ideally, art, pure, is of a sphere and of no country. The first real artists, always and everywhere, have been either importers or immigrants bringing the light with them. El Greco, an immigrant, defied the Spanish professors. We now call his work more truly Spanish than that of his local contemporaries. And in the same sense, the future will not fail to stamp that of our work as particularly American, in which the living painter here has injected no conscious thought of his hailing from Hoboken or Kankakee, and every consideration of pure and modern painting and of the supreme quality he may be capable of. I just absolutely was blown away by this. It's a long quote. I apologize for reading a long quote, but where he, in the 1930s, in the midst of a much larger debate about American identity, this is the kind of the birth of the regionalist movement, this very careful rejection of European influence. The Depression was really blamed on Europe and all of the related social ills. So the kind of demonization of the European influence and this desire to come up with something that was purely American. But he obliterates the argument and really makes the claim that there is no such thing as an indigenous American art other than indigenous American art. And what we consider to be American art is the art of many different sources coming together of immigrants. And this period, you'll notice throughout the show, there are many immigrant artists represented. And thinking of the context, the rise of Hitler really precipitated or catalyzed many artists to leave Europe and come to the United States. And they've since been folded into this history of American art that we are looking to explore in great depth in this show. So this is probably the most childish pairing in the show and maybe the most lowbrow, but also highbrow, because we have a wonderful Noguchi drawing on the left of your screen, standing nude from around 1931. And then on the right, we have a vintage print by Edward Weston, Eroded Rock, Point Lobos from 1930. And you can't tell me that the Eroded Rock doesn't resemble the rear of a human being. And I just love these this is kind of these funny, in my mind, probably not funny to anyone else, but these quirky little moments in the show that I really intentionally built in that add some levity. And really, you can't escape this comparison. It is, and I think Weston was very much aware of the fact that he was photographing a rock that resembled a woman's backside. So really thinking about the representation in various ways, and kind of coded representation, and the idea of seeing things that aren't there, seeing things for what they can be, essentially, as Minor White, I'm bastardizing a Minor White quote there, but looking at things and finding new things, and through pairings, because you might not have looked at this rock depending on your sort of humor level. If you're a mature person, unlike me, you would look at this and not necessarily see a butt, but putting them together, you can't escape that comparison. So here's this long, it also initiates this long wall of maritime pictures, kind of loosely grouped maritime pictures. And so I like the idea of also, since all of these works share the commonality of being created within the same decade, I like the idea of and I looked at that with kind of flower painting in the last week, in the last gallery we looked at prior to this, but to think about the ocean or the sea as a subject matter, and how different artists from the same time period came at the same subject matter or the same kind of genre in very disparate ways. And I'll just mention the David Smith sculpture, which I'll get to and speak about independently, in the center of the gallery. There is that wonderful sort of circular sculptural element on the top. And I just want you to remember that, because it's meant to resonate with an element in the photograph in the middle of that wall, which we'll see close up in just a moment. So here we go from Weston to Milton Avery. Milton Avery, and there shouldn't be a space between AV and ERY. I apologize for that on the screen. Milton Avery, sort of a painter's painter, one of the finest colorists in American art history, I would venture to guess. There's something about this composition that I find very peculiar, and that is that it's such a circular composition, but there's nothing in the center. Usually if you have a circle, it's meant to emphasize what's in the center of the composition. But here, he sort of prevents the clean kind of resolution of the composition by leaving that blank. And I don't know if that was intentional, but it does certainly keep you on your toes, because you almost expect something dead center. I don't know what it could be, another fish, something coming out of the water. But there is something quite unusual. And there is this sort of otherworldly quality to this image, this kind of whimsical, fantastical quality that I just love. And when you pair that with a very deliberately surrealist image by Herbert Baer, who was Berlin based at the time that this was created, but would immigrate to the United States at the invitation of the Museum of Modern Art in 1938 to help organize a show on the Bauhaus, which actually traveled to Andover that same year. Andover was always the sort of more radical New England outpost for MoMA shows. The Museum of Fine Arts Boston was really deemed a bit too conservative, or thought of them, had an attitude that was a bit too conservative for a lot of these really formative MoMA shows from the 1930s. And the Addison was the new kid on the block. We opened the same year as MoMA, and many of our founders were related to the founding of MoMA. So there was a lot of exchange, and shows like the really pivotal 1938 Bauhaus show came to Andover, which is pretty remarkable. So if you remember the circle from the Smith sculpture, I like the idea of this sort of ability to see through, or looking through these portals into the beyond. And you look through a portal in the Smith to an image that then further induces you to look through a portal. Baer was very influenced by photo montage and surrealist photography. And I think that influence is quite evident in this wonderful photograph. So this next painting is maybe not a fan favorite. It's in the center of this trio, and it's Waldo Pierce's The Birches from 1937. Waldo Pierce is an artist whose reputation has sort of suffered over the last 50 years or so. He was quite well known in his time. He was known as the American Renoir, and I think you can get a bit of that in just this photograph of the painting. Certainly the subject matter, the sort of mother and child, was very popular with Renoir. The very high key colors, the light effects. There's a lot that kind of loose impressionist brushwork. There's a lot that ties him to European impressionist sources. Waldo Pierce is actually a graduate of Phillips Academy, Andover, and I'll point out a few other graduates who are in the show. He was born in Bangor, Maine, to a lumber baron family, to a lumber family, and graduated Andover in 1903. He's was a longtime friend of Ernest Hemingway. They met during World War I in Europe, and he was known as this sort of larger than life character, a bon vivant, so to speak. He was a heavy drinker. He was a kind of a womanizer. He was this huge, burly, strapping guy. Kind of super macho American artist, renegade Hemingway type. He became really famous for this prank that he pulled on his friend John Reed, who was a famous communist sympathizer who's actually buried in the Kremlin. They were meant to go to England together, and they were going to take a cattle transport boat from Boston to England, which was probably not the kind of finest accommodations. Waldo Pierce was so displeased with his accommodations that as the ship was in Boston Harbor embarking on its voyage, he decided to jump overboard without telling anyone. And so en route, his friend didn't know where he went, and the captain actually arrested his friend and threw him in the brig for the disappearance of Waldo Pierce. And this is kind of an apocryphal story, so I wouldn't repeat it necessarily or write about it in your art history paper, but it has been told many times. So the story is that when the ship came and Waldo Pierce's friend disembarked, Waldo Pierce was standing on the dock in England. He had actually hitched a ride on a faster ship and it had beaten him. So there are these funny stories. So he's a big character, and he left behind a very interesting artistic legacy, and one that is I think understudied and perhaps deserving of more attention. And I've paired him with one of his contemporaries, Marston Hartley, better known contemporary, but also a painter from Maine, both Maine painters, both very clearly regionally affiliated as well. Painted the same year. This is Marston Hartley's Jotham's Island. It has a much larger title, but we'll just call it that for now. It depicts Seguin Island, which is an area in Maine near Bath, Maine. It's coastal Georgetown area. And it was the very kind of iconic summer destination for a generation of American modernists. And it was really anchored by the Zorachs, Marguerite and William Zorach, and Gaston Lachaise and others who would, John Marin was also in the mix, who would spend their summers there. So this is a really spectacular work that I encourage you to see in person. Marston Hartley actually wrote and considered it to be his finest work, which also it's very hard to take his word as gospel, because he was prone to really embellishment and also would say almost anything to sell a painting. And by the time that this was created, he'd undergone a pretty radical transformation. He's known for really two main bodies of work. That's a body of work called the War Motif series, inspired by the time he spent in Germany before the First World War. And there are these really elegiac paintings that combine Cubism with Expressionism, and many of them have these embedded symbols connected to a German soldier, and it's unclear exactly what the nature of their relationship was. But I think Marston Hartley lusted after this German soldier. We don't know if it was reciprocated, but he died in battle, and Hartley created this incredible suite of paintings that are really canonical works. He then had about a 20-year slump, more or less. He couldn't pay his bills. He was living in poverty. He was begging Alfred Stieglitz for money. And then he kind of comes to the realization in the 30s, when regionalism was all the rage and artists were from the sort of non-cosmopolitan areas, think of like Grant Wood and John Stewart Curry, artists who were often areas that we would now call flyover country. That work was seen as inherently American because it lacked a lot of the, although it was certainly influenced by European work, it lacked the kind of European characteristics that were being demonized in American art. And Marston Hartley seized on that opportunity. He was born in Lewiston, Maine. He had a miserable time in Maine for various reasons. I think it would be very, very, very difficult to grow up in the 1880s and 90s as someone who was different. He was gay, someone who was different in rural Maine with really no area of nothing around him. So he fled Maine and didn't return for years and years, but then very carefully constructed an image of himself as this native Mainer. He decided to return home. He actually wrote a poem called The Return of the Native. I mean, it's very heavy-handed, and he rebranded himself. So here's a photo, two photos taken the same year, and they show two completely different personas. One is New York Marston Hartley, where he's dressed in a suit. He's kind of he is the mythic modernist. There's kind of this figure in the background that's lurking, probably the kind of personification of artistic influence or creativity. And then you have him in Maine, and it's sort of like Mr. Rogers coming home and putting on his tennis shoes. He's becoming someone completely different. It's Maine Marston Hartley, where he went off and bought LL Bean clothes and has very self-consciously he very carefully crafts this image of himself as this kind of normal Mainer, run-of-the-mill kind of guy, which he was not, and starts to promote himself as the painter of Maine. And because of his connection to the Maine soil, it's kind of a fascist blood and soil sort of mentality that he espoused, and he had certain fascist political leanings. He saw himself as uniquely qualified, almost more than anyone, to capture the spirit of Maine. And that he would die not too long after he returned home to Maine. But that second body of work, the Maine pictures, really cemented his reputation and were quite profitable. And if he had hung on longer in life, I think he would have really seen his career explode, and he would have been in a financial situation that he was never in, which is one of comfort and stability. But it's also interesting to think about this composition in terms of the geometry of it and the forms. The forms are representational. You can tell that it's a seascape, but again, he is using these very blocky masculine forms. You can read phallic imagery in a lot of his Maine pictures. He was almost more free in these Maine pictures than in his kind of subversively queer paintings from the 19-teens. Here he's kind of more open with his explorations of homoerotic imagery. We don't have any of these paintings, but there are many paintings that he created in Maine of Maine types. He was really interested in sort of ethnic racial types. And so he would depict these very strapping Canadian Cajun, Acadian types who would come down to summer in Maine. He was obsessed with muscles and musculature and these hyper masculine male forms. This is a topic I could talk about all day. I actually wrote my undergrad and master's thesis on Marston Hartley, so my interest in him is quite knows no bounds. But I'll move on to this amazing George Gross watercolor, and thinking of the really interesting nature of both compositions in dialogue. And I think I have an image of, so here we have a group of three. You can see here, sorry to go back and forth, you can see the David Smith sculpture in the center of the gallery. We've since kind of rotated and are looking at the view that you would see when you first enter the gallery. And so you see these three pictures. They're not all pictures, three images. George Gross, then we have a Jackson Pollock sculpture, which I'll get to in a moment, and then an Arthur Dove painting. And I really enjoy this grouping because I think that hopefully works on a few different levels. One, this kind of color story that's going on, the sort of primary colors, these very rich reds, rich blues, and then you have greens and yellows as well as highlights. I'll talk about Street Fight from the Roof, 1934 by George Gross, who was a German artist who immigrated to the United States in 1933, so 1 year before this watercolor. And I hadn't done a great deal of research on this painting, and am pleased to have only figured out yesterday that the street fight that is being referred to is what is called the the sort of Austrian uprising. This was an armed uprising around this time that broke out in Vienna and other cities in 1934 between opposing conservative and socialist paramilitary forces. It's a very disorienting composition. There are these figures that you can barely decipher. You can see a machine gun being set up in the lower right-hand corner. You see what could be fire, explosion, splintered wood. And it's also this kind of bird's eye view that doesn't really resolve itself, because you're looking almost from another building at perhaps one of your sort of comrades on the other side of another building with the gun pointed down. He's looking down, maybe trying to pick people off on the sidewalk. But it's this image that just kind of explodes off of the paper and is quite dizzying and disorienting. And I think the same could be said of the Arthur Dove Autumn from 1933, which is a distillation of organic forms and really gets at what Arthur Dove was really seeking to accomplish, which was a quest for the condition of light and this really purely sensual experience of color and form. He's been, many people have claimed over the years that he was really the first American artist to create an abstract painting. And I think that there may be some differing opinions about that. But he really arrived at the abstraction that he would become quite known for, not through the very analytical, compositional kind of analysis, but through emotion. He really wanted to capture emotion. And I think both works really capture emotion quite beautifully. And I think you really get a sense of emotion in this Jackson Pollock work, which, if you've never seen a Jackson Pollock sculpture, you're very normal, because there are very few. There are only a handful of documented sculptural works by Jackson Pollock. This has a really amazing backstory to it. This was created in 1938. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the tour, not only are you seeing artists that you're not familiar with, but you're seeing works by artists who you are certainly familiar with, but are completely unrecognizable. We think of Jackson Pollock as Jack the Dripper, known for his splatter paintings, which were far more controlled than we think they were, which we'll see a really emblematic, iconic example of that in the next gallery. But here's Jackson Pollock as a younger artist. He was in his mid-20s at that point. He was institutionalized at the time in Westchester at a hospital for his addiction to alcohol, which would be an addiction that would plague him for his entire life and lead somewhat indirectly to his untimely death in the 1950s. This was created during his time as an inpatient at this hospital, and it was a gift to his doctor, Dr. James H. Wall, who would later recount to the artist's widow, Lee Krasner, that he encouraged Jackson Pollock as part of his treatment to work with his hands, and that this was done in a metal shop, a part of an occupational therapy program at the institution. And it was actually, the doctor would say, about the only thing Jackson did while he was a patient. He would later talk about the symbolism and the importance behind this work. And you can really see the influence, first of all, of Jackson Pollock's mentor, Thomas Hart Benton. People forget that before Jackson Pollock was an abstract expressionist, he was very much sort of in the regionalist modernist school. And that what we see as kind of the final iteration of Jackson Pollock's work, the drip paintings, that is a part of a much larger trajectory. He didn't just arrive at splatter painting one day. There were decades of work leading up to it. And this is one such work where he's telling a narrative in this piece. The doctor said that Mr. Pollock, that when he presented the plaque, he spoke of it as a cycle of man, and that you move away from infancy and your parents to mating, to the chaos of life, and to death. And then you also see man helping another, and death is at the bottom. So it's this sort of cycle of life from birth to death being explored in this one work. So imbuing great narrative content into a single piece. And so this work was donated by John Axelrod, who is a very prolific Boston-based collector. And it's a very important work that has been included in all of the major Pollock retrospective exhibitions, but not very frequently at the Addison. So it's exciting to have it out on view. So we're moving on to the rest of the wall, and we have on the left-hand side, one of the great icons of the Addison, Stuart Davis's red cart. And I wanted to set up this comparison for a variety of reasons. So here we have Stuart Davis's red cart on the left-hand side, and then we have John Kane's Liberty Bridge, Pittsburgh on the right. And both were created in 1932, so they are from the same year. And they both are depicting commerce, industry, and also waterfronts. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, because I haven't mentioned it, red cart depicts Gloucester, Massachusetts, which was a very popular artist colony, continues to be, and was a preferred summer destination, painting destination for Stuart Davis, who was really inspired by the 1913 Armory Show and really pushed himself from that point on to develop his own style of work that was definitely indebted to European modernism, but had something distinctly American about it. So he's applying the principles of European modernism, in this case, things like cubism with these faceted forms that are overlapping in interesting ways, the integration of text as well. But he's making it distinctively American by depicting this, archetype of New England, Gloucester Harbor. He saw himself as a realist as well, even though he was one of the most pioneering and really formally inventive American painters of his time. He didn't think of himself as an abstract painter because his work is always grounded in some reality. So here we see something that you wouldn't see it this way because he's transferring his own vision into his own artistic idiom. But these are warehouses that would have been recognizable. You see factories, you see the mass of ships, but what makes it quite fun and kind of also humorous in a sense, but whimsical, is that he's also kind of destroying the illusion of depth and of perspective and of kind of recognizability by making it out to seem like this is what we're looking at is just something kind of like a scrim hanging off of hanging. You can see a grommet almost, that yellow hole, and it's hanging up almost like a curtain in a theater. And so really obliterating the illusion of painting as kind of like the Magritte treachery of images, really showing that what you're seeing is not the thing itself, but a very carefully filtered representation of something. So he's really interested in form and color, the analysis of form and shape. And he was very deliberate about his compositions. And we actually own two studies for this work. So we can trace the compositional sort of tweaking that he did before arriving at the finished work. Red Cart was purchased in 1946. And it was kind of a miracle that it was purchased when it was, and for only around $500. So there are these wonderful moments of very prescient acquisitions where our predecessors here at the Addison really seized upon the opportunity. So comparing that with John Kane's Liberty Bridge, Pittsburgh, the same time, I think really kind of in black and white, so to speak, shows you the differences that it coexisted, the very different approaches to similar subject matter, and that there are interesting affinities between the two nevertheless, even though you might see one as the Kane is kind of more indebted to an American naive or folk art tradition, and then Stuart Davis more of an avant-garde modernist tradition. John Kane was really an American, archetypal American artist. He invented himself as an artist. He worked for many years on a railroad. He actually suffered the loss of part of his leg in a railroad accident. He immigrated. He was born in Scotland to Irish parents, immigrated to the United States, worked for the railroad, worked at the Frick coke ovens. He was very much a blue collar American worker. He then decided to start sketching. After he lost part of his leg, he became a watchman and had a lot of free time on his hands and would start drawing. And he started to then color in the drawings. And then he made the leap to painting. And he was actually sort of, quote unquote, discovered. And his work was shown at the Carnegie International, which is a very prestigious contemporary art series of exhibitions. And he became kind of like the male Grandma Moses, but maybe Grandma Moses in an urban Pittsburgh environment, because he was this 67-year-old at the time who had no formal training, who just kind of burst onto the scene, and it became something of a media sensation. What I love about these works is that you have sort of similar things at play, but handled in different ways. You have really dynamic diagonals, really interesting geometric form. You have kind of a standardized color palette. You also have the integration of text throughout. You have the little bit of text in the right side of the Stuart Davis, but then if you look at John Kane, you'll see he's written out almost full paragraphs of text. It's so detailed, and everything is almost everything is kind of labeled, or you can get a sense of the function of each building. And you also have the railroads, and you have a railroad watcher, or a railroad worker rather. He worked for the B&O Railroad, perhaps an allusion to the own accident that tragically took a large portion of his leg. I also like the pairing of Smith's arches. You have this dynamic geometry in both. And kind of the reading David Smith's sculpture in relation to these different works, and thinking about how putting things in conversation can change our perception of the art of the objects. So this is a view of these two small walls on either side of the portal into the next gallery. This, of course, we started off depressing, and we're going to end with depressing work in this 1930s gallery, Jacob Canaan's Cafeteria. These three works all dealing with alienation, loneliness, and the solitary figure. In Cafeteria, Canaan, who was a really pioneering Washington, D.C. based artist, who was kind of the godfather of the Washington color painters. He paints this solitary figure in a cafeteria. It's kind of that "who am I going to sit with" feeling when you're in a crowded cafeteria. Then you have Peter Sikiar, a Danish-American photographer rather, this young Black girl in South Carolina, sort of staring out from this window. And then you have the long shadows of a policeman or someone patrolling the streets in this Keppish photograph, all from around the same period. And finally, in this gallery, we have an interest, in my mind, I keep saying interesting, perhaps I'm the only one who finds this stuff interesting, but hopefully interesting juxtaposition between Paul Semple's Lamentations and Arthur Siegel's Right of Assembly. Paul Semple is a regionalist painter, really associated with Northern New England, Vermont in particular. Lamentations, he kind of, this is not a typical way for writing out Bible verses, but from when you look up Lamentations, chapter 5, verse 18, one translation or one source states that what he's referencing is this quote: "For Mount Zion, which lies desolate with jackals prowling over it," which I think if you read, you see that come to life in this image, where it's very much this masculine outdoor pursuit sort of image of these men all wearing, it could be an LL Bean ad, all wearing their New England winter gear, arranged in this very dynamic kind of triangular composition with their hunting dogs going up this very desolate mountain, and thinking about the jackals, the idea of the jackals prowling over the mountain. And then on the right, you have the opposite. You go from the austere and the white to the black, densely crowded in black. These are hundreds, maybe thousands of little tiny people, all involved in a labor action in Detroit against the Chrysler Corporation. So again, I think also from contemporary lens, it'll be interesting to see if we can ever gather, or if we ever want to. I never really wanted to begin with, gather in such tightly, in such a sort of claustrophobic tight group of people. So moving right along into the 1940s, this is my favorite gallery in the entire show. And I think it's the one that best sort of exemplifies what I was trying to get at with the notion of cross-currents. This gallery and this one room in the show, the gender makeup is quite equal. It's almost a one-to-one ratio of work by female artists to works by male artists. There are also many works in this show that have not been seen for long periods of time, but then also a lot of iconic works like the Jackson Pollock that you can't help but be drawn to almost immediately. Here we go. So if we went in and then turned around, I'm going to start on the right-hand side and sort of work my way around the room, which is what I've been doing so far. So you have this really nice vista of the Smith and then the Calder in the foreground, further dialoguing. So there are all of these dialogues that happen within rooms and then across rooms as well. So if you do come to see the show, I encourage you to kind of look at things from different angles because new things come out. So here we have Claire Falkenstein's Seed Dispersal from 1948, and then Esther Geller's Bridge Spaces from 1945. Both artists, female artists, are not, I would say, Claire Falkenstein is better known than Esther Geller. Esther Geller might be known to a few people who who know about the Boston art scene and the Boston Expressionist school. But neither are necessarily household names. Claire Falkenstein was a really incredible artist of varied talents. There's a sculptor, painter, printmaker, jewelry designer, teacher. She famously designed the gates to Peggy Guggenheim's Venetian villa. But she was invited. She did a lot of early work with plastics and was actually invited to a really pioneering show called The Material and the Immaterial that was quite controversial and was held here at the Addison in the late 1940s. It was all about plastic in art. And we have a very interesting collection of early work in plastic from the 1940s. Some of the plastics have not held up over time. They're complex chemicals and they break down. This has held up remarkably well. It's etched plexiglass and wood. And if you do come and visit, I urge you to really, I don't know if a guard says, don't do this, say that I said it was okay, I guess. But take your phone, and if you have an iPhone or a phone with a flash, it's really amazing to use the flashlight feature and hold it up against, or not up against, but far enough away from the work that you see the shadows in radically different ways. So it's a really kind of participatory piece. And then Esther Geller's work, which really blends surrealism with abstraction, because when you look very closely at these at this drawing, it's just meticulous. They're meticulously rendered sort of roots or threads, and I just love the juxtaposition of the Esther Geller with the Franz Kline. Franz Kline being a very famous abstract expressionist known for his kind of calligraphic looking black and white paintings. Here we have him using color, using a very bold yellow. And hopefully makes for a dynamic pairing, because you have in both this sort of hybrid abstraction. Both are abstract, but you could argue, reference the body, perhaps in the Kline reference the natural forms of flowers, or it could be read as a vase. You can also see kind of sinister motifs like gnashing teeth and gnarled limbs, or any kind of sort of biomorphic composition that you could read into both is quite possible. The Esther Geller piece, I don't know if that's ever been shown at the Addison, so it's exciting in these cases to bring work to light that maybe hasn't been seen for a while. In the center of the room, we have Alexander Calder's Horizontal Spines from 1942. This is another icon of the collection and has a very interesting backstory associated with it. Alexander Calder was quite close with Bartlett Hayes, the second director of the Addison. And we have really amazing correspondence between the two men, and it's correspondence that kind of continued for their respective lifetimes. This was purchased for the Addison, by the Addison rather, this particular mobile or stabile rather, because it's a stabilized mobile. This was purchased for just around $400, and you can actually see them haggling over price in the scan of a letter on the right, which has a drawing of our own stabile. So you have this amazing letter where the Addison is haggling with Alexander Calder over prices. And the Addison at one point actually wanted to leave open the possibility of trading our stabile in for a work that would maybe more directly respond to the Addison. And Calder was encouraged to come visit the Addison. And if he thought he could make a better work for the Addison, then we would trade it in. Luckily for us, he didn't. So we have this amazing, really important monochrome work by Calder in our collection. But again, it gets just to tease at some of the amazing treasures that are in our archives. And this letter, I believe, will be in an installation that I'll talk about at the end of the talk. So we're moving on to the next wall. Here we have Ruth Asawa's figures on green on top and Jacob Lawrence's kibitzers on the bottom. Ruth Asawa is an artist who has become increasingly popular over the past 10 years or so. She only died in 2013. She grew up in California in a Japanese American family. She was interned in the Japanese internment camps during World War II. She was unable to get into art school in California because of racist policies against the Japanese American US citizens in California. She went to Milwaukee for art school, but dealt with a great deal of prejudice there. She would spend really all of her career, most of her career in San Francisco. But this was actually painted while she was a student at the famous Black Mountain College in North Carolina, which was a real breeding ground for avant-garde artists across media in the 40s and 50s. Joseph Albers was one of the most famous instructors. He had a very strong relationship with the Addison. The Addison was the first major museum to show his work in the United States after he immigrated. And he was very loyal to the Addison throughout his life. He decided to suggest that his students, Ruth Asawa, submit to a show at the Addison called Art Schools USA, which was a show organized by Bartlett Hayes that was meant to kind of be an annual showcase of the best that was being created at the time in US art schools. So Ruth Asawa submitted from Black Mountain College, and this was the work that was actually shown back in the 1948 in this show that actually went on to travel. So the Addison is the very first museum in the United States to show the work of Ruth Asawa. She's best known for her hanging wire sculptures. Unfortunately, we don't own one of those, but if someone would love to donate one, my email is very readily available. One also just recently sold for over, I believe, $4 million. So I don't know if that's ever going to happen for us, but hopefully it will. But you can see her interest in organic forms really being tested and interrogated in this very early piece. Also in that Art Schools USA show that I mentioned was a work by Andrew Warhol from the Carnegie Institute. He would, of course, become Andy Warhol. And Kenneth Nolan, who was a very famous color field painter, who was also in this show. And the Addison was the first museum to show the works not only of Ruth Asawa, but of Andy Warhol and Kenneth Nolan. So we have this amazing history to build on. And we're making new discoveries. This is actually the fact that Andy Warhol first showed at the Addison was only established as fact within the last couple months. It was from a pretty innocuous research inquiry that really became this amazing find for us. We also have great archival material. Here's a really wonderful note that Ruth Asawa sent to Bart Hayes. There was a kind of a kerfuffle around payment for this work. She was extremely gracious and was definitely needed the money, but was going about it in a very calm way. But I just love this drawing of a snake. Again, we have this remarkable resource at our disposal through our archives, which will be highlighted in our 90th anniversary celebrations coming up. She also took classes at Black Mountain College with Jacob Lawrence, who's here represented by his kibitzers, part of his a series of dozens of paintings that he painted after returning from service during World War II. when he was really documenting his life in Harlem and the people that he encountered. And kibitzers, that's a Yiddish word that refers to the kind of onlookers who stare over your shoulder and make kind of suggestions as you're playing a board game. It looks like they're playing checkers in this piece, but he's capturing the sort of everyday existence of Black men in Harlem, kind of playing games and enjoying life. It's a very dynamic composition, lots of kind of tension in the forms, really interesting use of colors, and this sort of stylized rendering of human figures that he would become quite known for. So we're moving away into the corner, and I know that I'm just about to go over time, which is sort of my lot in life, but I promise I'll try not to go on for that much longer. But again, if you have to leave, feel free to. You'll see Hans Hoffman's Exaltment on the far left, and that's sort of like a laser beam. You can't avoid it. It has a life of its own. It almost doesn't need to be illuminated because it almost has its own light. This is a really important work for generations of students at Andover, because it was owned by Maud and Patrick Morgan, who were the kind of rock star leaders of the Andover art department in the 40s and 50s. And it used to hang in their house, and artists like Frank Stella would visit their home, and this painting would just knock them over. We were lucky enough to acquire it in the 60s. Stella has written very explicitly about the influence of this specific painting on his work, and has said something along the lines that he spent really his entire career trying to chase after the sensation that he felt when he first saw this painting. So its importance cannot really be overlooked. Hoffman being a teacher to any number of notable American artists from the time. He had his first retrospective at the Addison, which also happened to be the very first museum solo show dedicated to an abstract expressionist artist. So many firsts. But again, this very dynamic form that is abstract, but also you could kind of find points of reference to the human body embedded within. Same with the biomorphic abstraction of Mark Rothko. Again, this is a very familiar artist presented in a very unfamiliar way. What I also like about this is that this painting, Mark Rothko, was actually donated by Frank Stella himself in 1991. He is a very remarkable supporter of the Addison, and in the early 1990s donated large portions of his own collection of post-war art to the Addison, including this work by Rothko and really significant works by Jasper Johns, Ellsworth Kelly, John Old Judd, among many, many others, and his own work as well. So he's been an exceptionally generous donor and really devoted alumnus of Phillips Academy. So this long sweeping wall, we start off with this kind of trio of works dealing with the grid. We have Joseph Cornell, who I should also mention was an Andover graduate. We don't think of Joseph Cornell as ever having left his house, but he did. He was born into a very affluent family and I think had a pretty unfortunate time at Andover. Again, being queer in an all-male environment in the 1920s was probably not the hyper-masculine environment in all boys school, maybe not the safest environment or the most comfortable environment for someone who was queer and different. This is his Cage from 1949, one of his most restrained, I would say, and refined boxes. He's known, the Cornell box has kind of been, that aesthetic has been bastardized to the point that you can buy decoupage trays that look like Cornell. That style that he pioneered, the kind of bricolage, Victorian meets modern style, is one that's proved to be very commercially viable. This was inspired by an experience he had at a pet shop where he saw all these fantastical birds in cages, and he would recreate that in a gallery show. And you could almost see these little bits of carved wood, these balls, as super refined birds. Kind of interesting to think of it that way. So you have the grid with very muted colors into this grid with really kind of this exploration of different subtle variations of white and off-white. Anne Ryan, an artist who is really kind of criminally underknown. She made these really remarkable layered fabric and found paper and handmade paper collage pieces that we're very fortunate enough to have. She was very influenced by the artist Kurt Schwitters, but she's playing with different weights of paper, really playing with texture. This is something that you want to touch with color. I mean, it's such a subtle, nuanced piece. And you can see actually an exhibition announcement for a show that she had in Maine kind of peeking through the surface. So it's layered with autobiographical meaning as well. So another female artist, Charmian van Wiegand, who very clearly was inspired by de Stijl painting, Piet Mondrian, the sort of primary colored grids, but a very influential American artist who was really key to bringing avant-garde modernism to the United States, represented by this small grid. So we go from sort of black and white, like the Wizard of Oz, into color, and then we can't turn back. So we're going into phosphorescence by Jackson Pollock, one of his signature transitional pieces from the late 1940s, where he's moving from more figurative work to the kind of purely abstract. This work has incredible depth and texture, and this slide cannot replace your own firsthand experience of this work. It was likely inspired by the natural world, which is pretty interesting to think about Jackson Pollock and the points of reference that he brought into these otherwise on the surface purely abstract works. He was inspired by the natural phenomenon of bioluminescence. His wife, Lee Kraser, is actually quite frightened by it, but there are these wetlands near their property in Long Island that would glow at night on occasion, and that's from these bioluminescent organisms. And he was very interested in this bioluminescence and the sort of play of darkness and light. And the art historian Bill Agee has claimed, and I think he has a fair amount of evidence supporting that this is actually a seascape, which is an interesting reading. And when you think of it that way, you start to see it as sort of the surface of water and things kind of rising to that surface. It's also been hypothesized that it's painted over a recycled failed canvas. It was X-rayed, and you can see that there are these sort of curvilinear shapes that might reference human forms. That is something for further future study. Next to it is this work by Pearl Fine. Pearl Fine is another there's another work by, Irene Rice Pereira is right next to Jackson Pollock. Irene Rice Pereira, known for her also the idea of depth coming through in both literal and figurative. In Pereira's work, we have literal depth because she's painting on different panes of glass that recede into the back of the picture plane. So she's doing this kind of layered effect where you see through the canvas, or not canvas, you see through the transparent media that she's using, or the transparent support that she's using of glass. And that she's incorporating all of these wonderfully reflective and vibrant materials and colors underneath. Here we have an interesting pairing between Pearl Fine, who studied with Hans Hoffman, was very good friends with another famous abstract expressionist female artist, Louise Nevelson, also represented in our collection, but not in this show. She had two shows in 1943 included in Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century, Salon for Young Artists. So an interesting tie to Peggy Guggenheim linking many of the artists on this wall, Hans Hoffman linking many of the artists on this wall. I'll quickly mention, I forgot to tell, I realize we're short on time, but this is a fun story about, another fun story from our archives about this particular Pollock. The Addison was offered this painting from Peggy Guggenheim herself. She was in a position in 1950 when this was donated of needing to unload work for tax purposes. She offered the Addison actually kind of the pick of the litter of these smaller format transitional works that are exceedingly important. Bartlett Hayes, the director at the time, had a bigger idea in mind. He wanted her to buy 1A, which is an iconic work that I believe is in MoMA's collection. She was not in a position to pay the $3,000 that this cost. would have cost. And she suggested that she give us 2 Pollocks, but since Bartlett Hayes was obsessive about quality and really wanted only the finest example of any artist's work to be represented in the Addison's collection, he thought that phosphorescence was superior to the other example. So he turned down the opportunity to have a second free Jackson Pollock painting. And of course, 70 years later, we can look back and think, oh, that was a dumb move. But of course, that's not fair to Mr. Hayes. But just thinking about the many amazing prescient acquisitions, and then some of the things that we didn't drop the ball on it because we got this iconic masterpiece of abstract expressionism, but these funny moments where we were actually offered 2 but chose 1. There's also some letters from Peggy Guggenheim in our collection, in our archives, talking about how she's unable to get in touch with Jackson and Lee, and basically her own anxiety about her relationship with Jackson Pollock coming through in a interesting way. The final, so this pairing, Pearl Fine, who studied with Hans Hoffman, is represented by the work on paper on the left. She was also good friends with Maud Morgan, who originally owned this on the left, as well as the massive Hoffman painting that we saw. And then to the right, we have a really wonderful work by Hyman Bloom, who is one of the key members of the Boston Expressionist School, and was the focus of a really remarkable retrospective exhibition put on by Erica Hirschler and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston that just blew my mind away. He was perhaps best known for his paintings of cadavers, but just the really rich pattern, the rich color that he utilized to depict flesh. I mean, he was a master colorist. And he's an artist who is really only finally now getting his due. And he lived into old age. I mean, he was quite, he was nearly 100 years old, and his widow continues to live in New Hampshire. Hyman Bloom was one of those artists who chose not to follow his colleagues and moved to New York. And that really hurt his career in some respects in the long run, because he was not interested in self-promotion, was not interested in being at the center of the market. He was actually at one point he was heralded by many artists, his contemporaries, as being the most important American artist at the time. But he's not necessarily a household name because he didn't move to New York, which was really the only path acceptable if you wanted to reach mainstream critical acclaim at that time. This is the work on the far right is an abstracted map that he saw of a Neolithic Greek settlement that was excavated, that he then abstracted into this wonderful composition called Treasure Map. So interesting to look at these 3 works together and how form and color are handled in kind of complementary ways. I think there's something similar about all 3 of these works. Finally, here we are we're going to end on a sad note again, the depression corner of the show. So thinking about the context for all of these works, the 40s was a very trying time. We have World War in between, right to begin the decade and reach to the middle part of the decade, and then dealing with the fallout of war from 1945 on, and perhaps still today in some respects. Here we have a work by Kay Sage, a surrealist painter, who is again perhaps is certainly not as well known as she deserves to be. A lot of that is due to the fact that she was married to Yves Tanguy, the very famous European surrealist. And like Lee Krasner, who is referred to as Mrs. Jackson Pollock, she kind of her career suffered under her husband's long shadow. She has since, her image, her importance has since been recognized and remedied, and her work has been included in major surrealist exhibitions. This is an untitled work from 1940 that was donated to the Addison at the artist's death. And it captures a very particular mood that carries on throughout these 4 works. That is this mood of kind of desolation, of hopelessness, of the uncanny, of the eerie, of the unresolved. So we don't, this form is meant to kind of trouble us, to provoke some sort of emotion in us, in the viewer. And then thinking about this pairing, William Congdon, an artist that no one has heard of, or very, very few people have heard of. He spent a lot of his career in Europe and is really more closely affiliated in some respects with his European contemporaries than with his Americans. And you can't look at this and think that he didn't know about Jackson Pollock's work. There was definitely an exchange there of influence. I love this work, Destroyed City from 1949, an almost completely abstracted look at an obliterated, perhaps obliterated, bombed out European city. And then looking at The Head in the Wall by Clarence John Laughlin in 1945, of the known as the father of surrealism in America, or surrealist photography in America, of this empty gap in a building that seems to be in the process of being demolished. And you look through and you see the world beyond, and also the cross, and religion being kind of a theme that will carry through into the final work in the show. Moving into the final work, and I'm actually kind of proud of myself for only going 15 minutes over, we have Andrew Wyeth's Mother Archie's Church. You can see it has, unfortunately, fairly reflective plexiglass on it, so I'll keep this image up. Andrew Wyeth, I don't think needs any introduction. In 1945, he painted Mother Archie's Church, which depicts an actual place in Chadds Ford, which I visited. I had the opportunity to visit. Now the site is in ruins and kind of looks like Stonehenge, but was once a Quaker meeting house and a school. It's a very distinctive octagonal building, and it was known to Andrew Wyeth as Mother Archie's Church. And Mother Archie was a Black female preacher who would preach to a small congregation of African-American citizens of Chadds Ford, where Andrew Wyeth and his family lived. And it's pretty remarkable when you think about Andrew Wyeth's work, and his legacy has really been wrapped up in a lot of myth and sort of myth of his own making, and his sort of the team behind him, publicity, that kind of thing. But his world was extraordinarily small. He was another artist who refused to move to New York. He refused to really play the game that the New York artists had to play in order to get attention. You could walk from his house to this church, and he apparently was visiting the ruins of this church one day, kind of sitting as he did. He was a very solitary man, and he saw this bird enter in the window, and you get the glimpse of green outside, which is just so tantalizing. And you see the white dove coming through, and then you see the stovepipe and this nasty pigeon you see the pigeon poop and the pigeon kind of that rules over this this dilapidated building. And then you have the ceiling falling in, and you have one light, and some have, even as early as when this work was there's a great letter from Bartlett Hayes where he's saying, I read this as a metaphor for the Holy Spirit. And Andrew Wyeth basically shuts him down and says, I was just painting what I saw. There was a bird in a building and I painted it. It struck me, but he wasn't thinking about it in that such a profound way. He was very, very famously dismissed a lot of these deeper readings in his work, although I think it's important to think beyond the artist's own interpretation of their work. There was actually a naming contest that was pretty fun in the student newspaper when this was purchased. There was a contest to name the work, and Mother Archie's Church was actually the name that the young men of Andover chose for this painting. So a fun little story that gives a sense of the accumulated histories that these objects take on as they enter a museum collection, particularly at Andover, which is a collection that's so dynamic and always changing, and always new things are always being discovered. And to that end, I want to just, as I end now, I want to just promote a show that is coming up in May of 2021 of this year, just a few months from now, as we celebrate our 90th anniversary. We have a show called Learning to Look, the Addison at 90. And that's a show that will take over our entire first floor and will be all permanent collection, many, many highlights, and will be more thematic in nature. So you'll see works by some of your favorites, along with some favorite artists, including amazing new works that have never before been seen. I'm also working on an installation in our Museum Learning Center of archival material. So things like the telegram that was sent when 8 Bells was acquired, announcing to Andover that this massive purchase had been made. Letters, Edward Hopper letters. Someone mentioned the Edward Hopper letter and wanting to read it. You'll have your opportunity to, although we should probably publish that online, you'll have your opportunity to see the letter in person starting in May. So with that, I would be delighted to take any questions that anyone has. And I thank you again for sticking with me over these three different occasions.
Oh, thank you, Gordon. That was just great. And you're getting lots of thank yous and fabulous and wonderfuls.
Oh, thank you.
So, so back when you had the Marston Hartley, you had a couple of pieces up. Someone asked a question about the images and what they may have. He asked, is there a religious theme? Mary and Child, Blue on the Rock, Carpentry in the Boat, 3 crosses in the back. So it was that painting. So if you, I don't know if you flipped.
Oh, the Stuart Davis painting?
Oh, perhaps I'm wrong. You're right. I probably was half.
Sorry if this makes everyone puke, but I'm gonna go back.
Yes, no, that's fine. I don't think anyone minds seeing this again. So I may have been, no, it was
Not
actually, it was definitely Marston Hartley.
Oh, Marston Hartley, okay.
That one. It was that one.
Crosses.
So yeah, is there a religious theme was the question.
He was pretty agnostic. He, in his own person, he believed more in the spiritual and sort of life forces in the inanimate objects. You see a lighthouse in the background. He did do that. There are more explicitly religious works by Marston Hartley. Throughout his career, we don't own any, but there is a Last Supper image. There's a Pietà image of Maine lobstermen on a dock that's quite remarkable. This particular work, I would not necessarily read any sort of religious context into this.
Into that one. Okay.
But everyone can bring their own. This was, quite frankly, this was meant to be sold. He was working at this time on paintings that were very desirable, and there were 2 kind of opportunities where his own vision and the market aligned, and this was the second and last, where he was painting images that were he was able to fulfill himself artistically and creatively, but they were also marketable. They're lighthouses, they're lobsters, they're boats, they're waves, they're fishermen, they're beaches, they're things that someone could hang up on their wall. Whereas some of his works, the more explicitly homoerotic works, didn't have as much appeal. These certainly had appeal to wide swaths of art buyers at that time.
Okay. And then someone wanted to know, is the Kibitzers, the Jacob Lawrence painting, on display at the Addison?
Well, it's in this show, so it is on display.
Yes.
I don't know if that's, maybe I don't make this clear. I guess sometimes I just assume things are clear and they aren't, and that's my own fault. But all of these works are on view right now at the Addison. So if you have the opportunity, and they will be up until the first weekend in March, I believe. It's on our website. So if you are in the area and are comfortable with coming, you can see this. It's very frequently on view. It will be on view on our 90th anniversary show. So if you don't have the opportunity to see this remarkable Jacob Lawrence in person, in this show, you'll be able to see it in a completely different context right after this closes in a few months. So I should say, there are a few things that are always on view. Our model ship collection is always on view. The Venus sculpture in the Rotunda is always on view, and our Silhouette in Gallery 201. Those are always on view. Nothing else is always on view, but out of the things that are frequently on view, this is certainly one of them. So it's not on, it is on view. It is on view. That's the answer. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And Someone says they're fascinated by the idea of the artists working with plastic in the material immaterial exhibition and wondered whether there was a catalog or lists of artists in it.
So I'm actually looking, and I know this person very well who asked this question. And I would be delighted to send them the material that I've found, because I became very interested in this plastics exhibition. And there was a really interesting, there was a lot of press around it, and it was seen as this kind of silly thing, like how could plastic be art? And it was relatively new. They were still working out the kinks. But this is where a lot of the works, a lot of artists who have become major artists, like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, was in the show, and we bought out of that show. Naum Gabo was in that show. We bought out of the show. Irene Rice Pereira was in the show. Our work by her, which I showed, which is the layered glass painting, was not actually in that show. We didn't buy from that show, but she featured. We have installation shots. I think there was a brochure. So I know this person who asked the question, so I can send that along. But I think I've also and planning on doing. I also run our Instagram page and all of our social media. I work on that. So I'm thinking. I thought about doing a post about that show, because we have some interesting installation shots of crazy plastic mobiles hanging from the ceiling. Leo Amino is also, who's an artist whose career has been sort of resuscitated by Zwirner recently. He was in the show. It was a really radical show for its time, and very inventive, and emblematic of the types of shows the Addison was doing at the time.
Okay, and then finally, any thoughts on the goddess image in the Ruth A painting?
Sorry, what was that?
So it was any thoughts on the goddess image in, well, they say Ruth, and then
Asawa?
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you could definitely see these as sort of a Venus of Willendorf type form. So her work is, I would say, unrepentantly feminine. I mean, she's dealing with, even the abstract sculptures, she's dealing with kind of voluminous form that is curvy and often resembles sort of the lines of a woman's body. So I do think that's a very good observation. I also see a lot of phallic imagery in this, so there could be sort of a yin and yang going on, male, female. And she's exploring and beginning to explore forms that she would later kind of explore more eloquently or sort of fluently in other works. So it's a really interesting, very, very early piece. She also did a series of collages that Andy Warhol totally ripped off. She was doing these stamped collages at Black Mountain College that Andy Warhol would later appropriate. He also appropriated a lot of work from Yayoi Kusama, who's still living. And there's kind of an interesting article or something to be done about Andy Warhol stealing from these Asian American artists. But just an amazing artifact in our collection, and helps to tell a really interesting story.
Okay, and then someone would like to know about the art in your office, what we see in your background.
Yeah, so this is a giant painting by Thomas Hinckley, who was sort of, I would say, a Victorian parlor painter. This would have definitely been a great painting for, a gentleman's study. It was in a show that I did that was up. It was supposed to be up for a year, but it was cut short by the pandemic, called A Wildness Distant from Ourselves. And it was in the final room, which was this crazy kind of Victorian overload salon style. And this had been kind of languishing in storage because it's not the most necessarily progressive work of art. It's kind of very much of its time. And we had it conserved, and the conservators spent hours and hours and hours and hours scraping discolored layers and layers of discolored varnish off the surface of this painting. There's actually a great before and after and a halfway shot where you see one side and the other. So it's also huge. So it takes up a lot of room and storage. I probably shouldn't say that the Andrew Wyeth painting that I showed used to be in my office. It's all, but I will, it's all climate controlled and highly secure. So the environment in my office is no different than the environment in our storage or in our galleries. So it's a very safe place for it. And the light exposure is mitigated by UV filtration, etc. So I had a gap. This had to go back into storage. Thought might as well have something bold. And so we hung it up behind me. So that's what that is. I've actually gotten emails about this. So I'm glad. It's called, it's called the Staggett Bay. And it's this, people were actually disturbed by this painting when it was in the show because it's a dog that we'll pretend is just knocked out or not dead, sleeping. The dog is sleeping and it's been kicked by the stag. And the other dogs are angry at the stag, but you can tell that they're not going to be the victors. The stag is going to run off and there's a bunch of other deer in the background. So that's my long rant about my office art, but
Thank you. And then someone says, off topic, but is there a Chihuly glass piece of the Addison?
Yeah, it's this will make you vomit. Also, I'm going to go back to the beginning because it's in the very first image. We were just talking about that actually. My colleagues and I were talking about how I wasn't here when the edition put on, but there was actually a plan to do this crazy like red flame-like installation in the on the green roof, but instead we went way more subtle, and I think it's very, very elegant. But these are from his float series, so they float on, not actually, but they kind of look like they're floating in our green roof. But they're these blown glass, black and gold and silver pieces that are often covered by snow, but they're beautiful to look at throughout the seasons. And so if you come here and want to see them, you just have to go to the MLC and look out the windows and you'll see them.
Right.
You have Dale Chihuly, but it's not like the over the top kind of Dale Chihuly that you would expect.
Right. Okay, I do think people have loved your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And so I think I think we're good. I think that's all the questions. And so thank you. This will eventually be, the recording will be on the library's Vimeo channel. So that's where you can find it. It takes about a week or so to get it up there. And Gordon, thank you. We're looking forward to doing more of these over time. So.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
All righty. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.